with the paper Raising the Dead, Rock Music in Contemporary Russian Cinema. Please, Rita.
Thank you so much, Valery. Let me share my screen. I have quite a few clips to show you, so I'll get right to it. Can you see the screen? Yes, perfect. So as mentioned in a number of previous papers at this conference, the turn of the new millennium saw an increase in references to rock music, Soviet rock music films, and deceased rock musicians in Russian cinema, with directors referencing, celebrating, and paying homage to the late Soviet rock star on screen. Specifically, the life and celebrity of Viktor Tsoi, Russia's ultimate rock icon, has enjoyed increased cinematic interest in recent years. So to add to the chorus of questions that we have already heard during this conversation in this conference, why? Right? Why do these films about Tsoi keep being produced in such rapid succession? And why now? And what, of course, does this reveal about the post-Soviet condition as a whole? One obvious answer is, of course, commemoration, right? And the fact that 2020 marked the 30th anniversary of Viktor Tsoi's tragic death in a car accident at the age of 28, just 1 year before the collapse of the USSR. At the time of his death, Tsoi, the lead singer of the Leningrad band Kino, was at the very peak of his fame, both as a rock performer, but also as a film star. In fact, the popular journal Soviet Screen, Sovietsky Ekran, voted Tsoi Best Actor in 1990. And as films featuring late Soviet rock culture became paradigm-shifting cultural phenomena in the late 1980s, Tsoi appeared in most of them, becoming the cinematic icon of Soviet rock. In the span of 4 years before his death, Tsoi took part in around 7 projects, both feature films and documentaries. Hence, the resurgent attention to rock culture as a filmic product specifically is not simply a function of commemoration, but rather reveals the enduring significance of late Soviet rock music in contemporary Russia, functioning as an ideologically ambiguous, nostalgic conduit and convenient liminal space for historical reckoning for both the aging last Soviet generation as well as the post-Soviet. So what interests me today is how this functions on the formal level through the lens of film structure. So to illustrate this, I would like to focus on a series of closing sequences that act as Soviet intertexts for post-Soviet rock music films. So of course, Solovyov's cult film Assa, released in 1987, features perhaps the most famous Soviet rock closing sequence, widely considered to be a major Soviet cinematic event that signaled the changing mores of perestroika. As the credits roll, Viktor Tsoi performs his iconic anthem Changes, or Peremen, which in recent years and months has been adopted by protest movements in Russia and the former USSR. According to the plot, Tsoi is invited to take a job as a restaurant musician after the original performer of Bananan is killed. And in socialist realist terms, Tsoi is musically picking up his dead comrade's fallen banner, inscribing himself into the pantheon of late Soviet rock celebrities. I'm sure you've seen this many times. Let's refresh our memories with this clip.
Тепла, зелень стекла, вместо огня дым. Из сетки календаря выхвачен день. Красное солнце сгорает дотла, день догорает с ним. На пылающий город падает тень.
Okay. And the credits roll. Seeing Assa in theaters upon its release became a symbol of prestige, with most moviegoers interested almost exclusively in watching Tsoi perform. Rashid Numanov's 1988 film The Needle continued Tsoi's musical and cinematic coronation. In the film, Tsoi plays another altruistic hero, a recovered drug addict named Moro, who helps his ex-girlfriend overcome her drug addictions and also fights off some gangsters. In the last scene of the film, Moro is stabbed, and the credits roll as the spectator attempts to guess whether his wound is fatal.
Разрешите прикурить?
Место на улице ждут отпечатков наших ног.
And then Moro walks away, and there's an edited sequence of scenes from the film and also a martial arts action scene kind of involving Tsoi directly preceding the credit roll, which sort of acts as a late Soviet music video of sorts. So like Solovyov, Nugmanov utilizes the narratively liminal space of the closing sequence and also credits to showcase both Tsoi's music and also his emerging celebrity status. Both Solovyov and Nugmanov released sequels to their films in 2008 and 2010, respectively. Solovyov's Dva Asa Dva revisits the promise of Tsoi's changes, suggesting that the demands of the late Soviet generation have failed to yield desired results. And Nugmanov's The Needle remix in this film, Tsoi is mostly confined to an animated representational space, underscoring the gravity of his loss as a cinematic subject. Sergei Laban's 2005 film Dust is the first to kind of visually recontextualize Tsoi's song changes, which the director places alongside, again, the film's credits performed in sign language.
Вместо тепла терек стекла, вместо огня дым. Из сетки календаря выхвачен день. Красное солнце сгорает дотла, день догорает снегом. На пылающий город падает тень.
So Laban's film is a biting critique of post-Soviet society, and Laban, who goes on to feature a Viktor Tsoi impersonator in a later film, Shipito Show, both culturally invokes and recontextualizes Tsoi's iconic performance. Tsoi's changes performed in sign language culturally code switch Solovyov's original paradigm-shifting message. The effect is one of defamiliarization, irony, and most importantly, advocacy, with Laban opting for satire as a vehicle to raise awareness on disability issues. The next two films that I want to discuss deal with Viktor Tsoi's life more directly. Kirill Serebrennikov's 2018 biopic Lето, perhaps the most popular cinematic text in this conference, is the first non-documentary to cinematically tackle Tsoi's biography. As Anna's and Kevin and Eric's papers have shown on the first day of the conference, the film frames rock music as a liberating element in Russian culture and makes clear overtures to Russia's current political environment. And one of the implicit questions that Lето asks is whether the culturally transformative legacy of Soviet rock is still viable in contemporary Russia. And without necessarily providing a direct answer, Lето instead fashions a mythology of Soviet rock, and in its closing sequence, which is once again a concert scene, hints at a metaphysical afterlife for Russia's deceased rock heroes, revealing the film's position on the redemptive potential of Soviet rock music. So let's watch this clip.
Витя, в тебя верит Михаил, значит, ты Бог.
Ладно, Бог. Бог-то у нас один, а?
Я за.
О, красавцы, романтики. Вот это вот, то, чего не хватало нам в рок-клубе.
Это все Марьяш придумала.
Не вертись. Не бух, мальчики. Кулачки держим. Из обкома звонили, просили билеты оставить.
Майк приехал? Не видел. А ты его не звал?
Позвал.
А что его звать? Он у нас в правлении клуба, ему что, особое приглашение нужно? Ну?
Ведь ты не о том сейчас думаешь.
А я согласна с ней. Ведь ты не о том думаешь. Все, мальчики, пора начинать. Поехали, поехали.
Все, я объявлять пошел.
Добрый вечер, дорогие друзья! Сейчас на эту сцену выйдут музыканты, ради которых мы все здесь собрались. Встречайте, группа «Кино».
Раз. Я знаю, мое дерево не проживет и недели. Я знаю, мое дерево в этом городе обречено. Но я все свое время провожу рядом с ним. Мне все другие дела надоели. Мне кажется, что это мой дом. Мне кажется, что это мой друг. Я посадил дерево, я посадил дерево, я посадил дерево, я посадил дерево. Я знаю, мое дерево завтра может сломать школьник. Я знаю, мое дерево скоро оставит меня. Но пока она есть, я всегда рядом с ним. Мне с ним радостно, мне с ним больно. Мне кажется, что это мой мир. Мне кажется, что это мой сын. Я посадил дерево, 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 я...
So Christian motifs of defying death and resurrection, a common Serebrennikov trope, abound in the scene. Zoe is referred to as God, becoming a Christ-like figure who ascends to the throne of rock celebrity, only to die at a young age for the sins of the Soviet bureaucracy. We hear the song "Я посадил дерево," I planted a tree, which is a meditation on the fleeting nature and fragility of life. Serebrennikov captions the performance with the date of Tsoi's death, making a metaphorical link between the fragile tree and the rock star himself. In Serebrenikov's interpretation, the changes Tsoi is singing about are metaphysical, a posthumous transformation from a living icon to an enduring spectral presence and artistic precedent for resisting oppression. Mike Naumenko's narrative exit takes this one step further, insinuating a sort of immortality for the two rock performers. When Mike steps out for a smoke, Serebrennikov is suggesting a type of sublimation and defiance of death itself. The phrase "stepped out for a smoke" or "просто вышел покурить" can be found on Soviet rock music memorabilia and functions to obviate the finality of dying. Moreover, throughout the film, Serebrennikov makes it very clear that he's crafting a cinematic version of an imagined past, foregrounding this past's aspirations into the present historical moment. The last film I want to discuss today is Alexei Uchitel's Tsoi, which was released just this past November. It is a fictionalized dramatization of the days following Viktor Tsoi's fatal car crash in rural Latvia. In the film, the driver of the bus, Pavel Socialist, with whom Tsoi suffers the fatal collision, is quite improbably tasked with taking the rock star's body back to Leningrad. The clip that I want to show you takes place after Pavel successfully delivers Tsoi's body, by which point it is already buried. And please watch how Uchitel references both Assa and the Needle, providing a new reading of Tsoi's cultural legacy, one that I think has a clear populist bent.
Разрешите прикурить? Цой жив. Цой жив! И есть чем платить, но я не хочу победы любой ценой.
Uchitel's surviving family members were vehemently against the film. So his son even wrote a personal letter to Putin asking for the film to be shut down. And one reason for this, I think, is the fact that Uchitel seeks to displace Tsoi's legacy from being the domain of his family and collaborators or rock culture to something that belongs to a larger national heritage. For much of the film, Tsoi's body, and therefore his legacy, is ultimately in possession of Socialist, the late Soviet everyman, and the film's consistent moral compass, despite effectively being the one who kills the rock star and ends his legacy in the film. Uchitel's film is an anti-elitist parable where a deafening cultural loss is transformed into a collectivized national commodity in which the factual killer effectively becomes the hero. Meanwhile, Tsoi's coffin corpse is preserved and protected like those of the earliest Soviet leaders. The bus essentially serves as a sort of mausoleum for Tsoi. Moreover, a Tsoi lookalike making his way home from the funeral, ostensibly, is a reference to Nukmanov's The Needle, of course. He carries a knife, which references Moro's stabbing, and of course, hints at the death of the rock star himself. When the young man exclaims, Tsoi lives, this gives an answer to what happened to Moro and also exonerates Pavel from the responsibility of causing Tsoi's death. If Tsoi lives, then of course, Pavel and the aging late Soviet generation by association are innocent. Another question that Uchitel implicitly asks in the film is who allows Tsoi to continue living? And the answer is twofold here. Tsoi's fans, of course, and the general Russian populace, but also filmmakers like himself, Solovyov, and Lugmanov, whose efforts had brought Soviet rock into the mainstream cinematically in the late 1980s. So in conclusion, the resurging rock film genre offers a productive and relatively risk-free venue in which the post-Soviet condition can be negotiated. If nostalgia for the late Soviet period is a symptom of Russia's collective trauma after the collapse of the USSR, then the deceased and therefore agencyless figures like Tsoi allow us to relive the seismic sociocultural shift of the collapse of the Soviet Union and emerge with either a sense of aspirational hope for changes, or alternatively, as is likely the case for the post-Soviet surviving generation, with a sense of accomplishment. Moreover, the narrative position of Tsoi's music and closing sequences acts as an unfinished postscriptum for both the film narrative and the narrative of Russian identity after the collapse of the USSR. Existing neither fully inside nor fully outside the confines of the cinematic spectacle, these sequences create a liminal narrative space where post-Soviet sociocultural anxiety can be reenacted and processed, creating an ideologically porous and semantically malleable recycled material to package both Russia's past and its current tumultuous present. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rita, for your fascinating talk. I think that Tsoi is one of the most important public person in contemporary Russia now. This is a sort of Lenin, I think, one of them now.
Absolutely agree. Tsoi жив, Tsoi жил, Tsoi жив, Tsoi будет жить.
That's wonderful ideas. Thank you very much. But we should go further. Now we are listening the paper of Ola Siebert, University of Quebec, Montreal, different forms of nostalgic expression in online communities, German nostalgia and Polish post-peasant nostalgia. Please.
Hello, I'll try to share my screen. Can you see it? Yeah? Okay. Voila. Okay. Hello, everyone. As Valerie said, my name is Ola Siebert, and I am a PhD student at Faculty of Communication at Université du Québec à Montréal. This project stemmed from another project that I'm working at. It's about German nostalgia more particular, and I thought it would be interesting to look at also how Polish nostalgia looks like in online communities, as I'm Polish, and yeah, I'm interested in nostalgia in general. This is a topic of my PhD research. So I just want to start with, maybe this is repetitive. I didn't have a chance due to time change to follow the conference, but I will do so afterwards when I have some time from YouTube videos. So I just wanted to start with how nostalgia is looked at in general. From my experience and from my research, it is frequently negatively understood as something that is connected with extreme right, with subjects like with topics like "Make America Great Again." Frederick Jameson talks about cannibalization of history, so reusing the tools and different artistic techniques in postmodernism, and this nostalgia replaces a real history. And as Bauman said, we are currently infected with nostalgia. We began to hope for a vaguely remembered past, attributing to it the values of stability and reliability. As we will see slightly in my presentation. Nostalgia is also relatively well studied when it comes to cinema, TV, movies, fashion, but not so much when it comes to online communities. And as as we discovered with Professor Niemeyer and Professor Selina, new technologies can trigger nostalgia, and this is seen in Nostalgia Online in the Facebook communities, where this nostalgia is discovered in a multidimensional and multispatial level. So it's not only about the past, not only about the present, but also about the alternative future that we want to imagine. So in my conclusions, I will also speak about especially Facebook, where I focused my research as a medium where you are supposed to post updates about your daily life, expand your network of friends, relatives, but it serves for online communities, online nostalgic communities, as a sort of archive where different nostalgic expressions are posted and shared among users. So I started my research when I started working on a project Nostalgie with Professor Niemeyer, Maria Selina, and Lena Hübner at UCAM. I posted here a website where you can find information about that part of the research. But what I would like to present is a comparison between what I discovered in context of the research of the project Nostalgie and my own, let's say, personal interest towards Polish nostalgia. So when it comes to my observations, I focused on a Polish group called Dawne Czasy, Old Good Times, and I compared this group with a group about Nostalgie, about German Nostalgie, called DDR Erinnerungen, so DDR Memories and Nostalgie. And I started with review of literature, so I came up with different types of post-Soviet nostalgia without memory, as said Apadurai, and it is especially identitarian nostalgie. So we are trying to reappropriate the design or the aesthetics of the GDR in everyday objects, and we somehow decide to forget certain circumstances or the entire political and economic reality. So as you can see, members of the group are sharing pictures of milk canister, I think you call them, or milk bottles, or coffee, and objects and brand names which are connected to East German folklore. And it is really interesting to see the discussions that are in the comments. So you are always see, do you know this? Have you tasted it? Does it still taste the same? I tried it once now. It tastes like it tasted in 30 years ago. So you see this kind of nostalgia for folklore and objects and brand names without thinking about the political reality or socio-economical reality. Next, I found existence of, let's say, social nostalgia. So the will to go back to previous political system, and you can see, especially this is especially expressed by former inhabitants of East Germany, for whom the previous system or the Soviet system appeared to be more egalitarian, supportive, and more human. And Szoliak, that I cite here, she wrote about a 2004 poll where 61% of East Germans believe that the GDR provided a better distribution of resources. 85% consider that it offered better protection against crime, and 78% better social security. And of course, it's a poll from 2004. It's ancient, but I'm pretty sure this kind of feelings from what we observed is still there. So in case of social nostalgia, we refer to the past and to the present, and we compare the two systems. And the comparison is sometimes really gives really surprising or even paradoxical results, because in some cases, a person decides to forget tragic personal stories under the Soviet regime and does not criticize the political system at all. And on the contrary, these stories are depoliticized to recreate a nostalgic vision of the past era. And another academic, Buma, she compared it to compartmentalized disremembering. So we decide not to remember what the real life was really. And I put here just two images. One is known trains still in Poland and sometimes in German that you can see, and the people were describing the ambiance. I'm not sure if you say that in English, but they are describing how you traveled, how many people you met, how easy was to talk to people. Whereas now, compared to trains without compartments, it's much more difficult to make any kind of relationship on long distance journeys. And also a comparison between schooling in PRL, in Polish Soviet Republic, and now. So then we were one, and everyone was equal. And then you had the discussions comparing how children are educated now in school and how it used to be before. And all the values that come back are such, you are forgetting what was real, what was the daily life, and some comments are trying to say, look, it's nice, the values were good, it's just the reality was this and that. So it's also there are some people, some Facebook group members who are more let's say they are trying to say your values that you are representing are not really real. And then the post-peace and nostalgia, which I found a really in the beginning I thought it was a bit negative, but then I read more and I discovered the definition of post-peace and nostalgia is connected with post-peace and people's economy, which is a definition or a term that I take from Buzelka article. And it means that the people do not miss ideology, which few of them actually believed in, but some features, so some values of social reality that cease to exist with the end of communism. So it's a really rustic and romantic, and even spontaneous character of socialist society, which is opposed to the bureaucratization and rigid European or Western rule-based life of today. So some people believe that with the end of the Soviet regime, the political or economic transformations are working in reverse. So instead of promised ideals of democracy or capitalism or those things, we have rather slowed down or even stopped. For example, in case of the development of towns and villages, which now have to fight to keep a good public transport network. We also use different linguistic forms in times of socialism. The farmers registered to PGR, to big national farms, and now they are registering to ideology of ecology, to be able to touch the European subsidies. But this post-peace and nostalgia also means it is a kind of social nostalgia personally for me, but the difference between what I described before with social nostalgia in Germany, I feel that the relationship with the other, so the person who works for the regime, is slightly different. And there is, I feel also there is a different connection to the land, to the society in general. And this is best described by Pasieka, who stayed with people in Polish people in rural parts of Poland. And she says, while discussing people's remembrances and experiences of socialism, it is necessary to reject the idea of a clear-cut binary opposition between resistance and compliance, us and them, private and public. And the socialist system meant its simultaneous rejection and accommodation, and the interviewing of different contradictory practices and discourses. So somewhat, for example, the other, so a person who represented the regime, the policeman or a bureaucrat, could be at the same time our, let's say, enemy, but also our friend, depending on how our relationship before and after looked like. And this is not something that I find in any of the German nostalgia, and I find this really fascinating. And Drakulic describes, of course, Slovenian society, but I think it's quite relevant to the Polish society as well. Since there is no such thing as a self-sufficient communist household, you depend fatally on your neighbor for all kinds of favors, from borrowing coffee or sugar to washing, cleaning, or cursing politics, or getting your child enrolled in a better school. He or she will inevitably see you in your around-the-house clothes. Perhaps there is a good side to that. People don't have any illusions about each other. So this is something that I also saw whenever Polish members were sharing images. They were frequently from private archives, private pictures of themselves in kindergarten or at school. And this was not the case with the German groups where sharing private pictures was not that often. I found maybe 2 or 3 during the whole research this year. So when it comes to my methodology, as I said, I based it on the project that was already ongoing. So it is a mix of qualitative, quantitative research and digital ethnography of 2 Facebook groups. It's a year-long online study, which is still ongoing, but I focused on October 2020 for the German group because of reunification celebrations, and November 2020, as I thought this might be also a good opportunity to look at celebration of 11th of November, our Independence Day. In case of a German group, we followed up with interviews with semi-open questions with 5 people, four or 5 people. But I didn't have a chance to talk with any of Polish Facebook members. So that's why this study is still ongoing, as I would like to, in the next year or this year, follow up with interviews to be able to compare even better 2 sorts of nostalgias. In terms of my preliminary results and observations, I give you a total number of posts observed during 2 weeks in October and 2 weeks in November. And the top type of post that I observed So in case of a German group, we see mainly sharing images of daily objects, cameras, cars, brand names, coffee, daily objects, brand names, and also recipes for traditional German cuisine. And in case of Daphne Chasse, the proportion is slightly different, as members focus mainly on sharing images about their families, relationships, friendships, places, towns that trigger nostalgia, film and music. And I should also say that there are many irrelevant posts, which means either posts about coronavirus, either posts which are supposed to trigger political comments, or this kind of posts which are deleted in the German groups. So we know that the admins of those German groups take time to select posts which are directly connected to nostalgia, whereas with Daphne Chasse, I saw many posts which had nothing to do with PRL or nostalgia or anything really connected to Polish type of nostalgia. So in terms of a Polish post, what I was talking before, there are humorous posts comparing daily life today and then. There are posts which are supposed to trigger really political comments, like comparing. And it's very drastic. I'm sorry, but this is what I found in the group, comparing Polish citizens in Gdańsk, and then how the image of bean containers in the same place, and the comments were very, very, very extreme right. The person who shared this was also sharing it from the Facebook group of Polish extreme right. And then you have also an example of funny or humorous post about roads, which are and we blame engineers for really bad roads in Poland. And then also different types of coronavirus updates, and also political comments below that I didn't post because I would need to have a bit more time to go through them. So in conclusion, I found that the especially Polish nostalgia is not easy to be defined or categorized. I found post-peasant to be really simplification of what I observed on in Facebook. But there is definitely a difference in terms of approaching the otherness, who is the enemy, who is the friend, whereas in a German group or in German interviews, we saw this divide between Western and Eastern Germany still existing, maybe because of the difference of history, mentality in Germany and in Poland. But the thing that are in common is missing the spirit or the values of community, and also missing the sense of togetherness, of being one society. In a Polish group, as I said, there are many political discussions reappearing, which are mixed with news, comparing today with the life under PRL. Also talking about how the difficulties of living under capitalism. Yeah, so I really would like to go through with the interviews with Polish members of nostalgic groups, to be able to compare a bit more the answers. And I also, what I would like to also just put there is how our relationship with Facebook and archives differs for, let's say, a person who uses Facebook just to share their own images to people they know, and a member of a nostalgic group which shares the images from the past on the nostalgic group. This relationship between a new media such as Facebook, which is considered to be a medium for updates and sharing news, is really difficult, mainly because whenever you share something on Facebook, it's supposed to be spontaneous and it doesn't disappear, but it's difficult to be found. So let's say you want to find a news from 1 year ago about this, it is really very difficult unless you know a person by name. It's very difficult to go back. So it's a really interesting medium to work with when you think about archives and nostalgia, because the posts that you are posting are really disappearing. And people with whom we talked are saying they want to extend the memory of people by putting posts about them or their memories online, but they don't realize how difficult their memories are to be found after some time. So this is, if anyone is interested, this is some articles that I focused on while preparing for this presentation, also for my research. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ole, for your presentation. It is very thoughtful talk, and I just would like, I cannot ignore this opportunity. Sorry for this. I interrupt our discussion for one moment. I would like to draw your attention to the fact, that Ole is from Quebec. Is from Montreal, but in my eyes, this is a very important, very symbolically important fact for our conference and all, because of, in my eyes, Montreal and Quebec is what we can name a motherland of the contemporary theory of cultural recycling. This is actually true. I would like to share with you one picture, just one. Sorry for this. This is very interesting person. Just a moment. You can see him now. I think this is Walter Moser, who, in my eyes, suggested one of the first very systematic, very thoughtful attempt to think about what does it mean, cultural recycling. And moreover, he presented a whole program, very short, but whole program, what we can do with this concept, how we can develop this concept further. And he involved in this field a lot of very various notions like nostalgia, postmodernism. And I was surprised during reading a lot of literature about this subject, that Walter Moser was quoted just a few researchers, and I would like to popularize his works. That's all, and we can continue. Just a moment. I will. I don't know how to stop this. Oh, thank you, Julia, for your help. And now we continue our discussion. Our next presenter is Philip Decker. His paper is Exploring the Post-Soviet Underworld in the SCP Foundation. Please, Philip.
Thank you very much. Very good to be here, and thank you also, Dr. Vugan, for organizing this excellent conference, which has been wonderful. So I'm a PhD student at Princeton. I actually focus on German history and German-Soviet relations in the 20th century, but I'm also very interested in internet culture and nostalgia and the topics that we're talking about today. So I'm just gonna very quickly share my screen here, and I'm gonna, just a moment. Let me just bring up the PowerPoint. Hope everyone can see this. And just a moment. Now let me set it up. Okay. So exploring the post-Soviet underworld in the SCP Foundation. This is a topic that has very, very little scholarly output whatsoever. Actually, I can only think of 1 or 2 articles that even sort of surface of the SCP Foundation, but it is a very rich and deep thing. So I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. So the plan here is just I'm going to give you an overview of what this is first. I'm going to give you some examples that don't have to do with Russia per se. Then I'll introduce Russia and SCP. Then I'll give you a case study of one particular thing with a short video that's just 2 minutes long. Then I'll do an analysis, and then I'll just give some concluding remarks. And I just want to warn everybody, there are some images or topics that might be a little bit disturbing or unsettling, just as a forewarning. So what is the SCP Foundation? Well, it's an internet-based writing community that specializes in paranormal supernatural fiction. And it goes back approximately 15 years, 14, 15 years to 2007. The idea is that SCPs are supernatural objects, creatures, people, things that defy the known laws of reality. So, and in this universe, the SCP Foundation is a global, secretive agency whose entire purpose is to just control these objects and understand them in order to stop them from harming society. SCP stands for Secure, Contain, Protect. Each SCP is cataloged in numerical order on the community website as a series of encyclopedia entries. So number 1, number 2, number 3, there's more than 6,000 now. It's a very productive internet writing community. And these entries they're not always horror stories, but they have many horror elements and frequently, and the SCP Foundation has a reputation for being a horror site. It's popular across the world. Many countries, more than actually a dozen sister sites exist in different languages, including in Russian. SCP has there's a lot of fan content, art, films, plays, video games. Especially popular are SCP Containment Breach, which is a video game, SCP Secret Laboratory, and Control. And all of those games are about being stuck in a Foundation facility and having to deal with these strange things that they keep there when they escape. So this internet movement does have some literary antecedents. This is sort of my reading based on how much I've read of this. I would say Edgar Allan Poe, Lovecraft, Bulgakov, I would say, especially in Heart of a Dog, Serce, that's very, very important. Garcia Marquez, Harlan Ellison, and Borges. There's a lot of, I think, aftershocks of Borges in this writing. So first, I'll just give you some example SCPs so you understand how this works. So for example, SCP-087 is a dimly lit, infinitely descending staircase in which you are followed by a smiling man with 2 round black eyes. Number 106 is the evil spirit of a traumatized World War I veteran that causes everything it touches to crumble and decay. Number 1471 is a downloadable iPhone app that sends the user a series of disturbing photographs of a man with the head of a wolf. If the user opens the messages, he or she will start seeing the wolf in their actual vision all the time for the rest of their lives. Number 1733 is a DVD of a basketball game in which the spectators and players are gradually more and more aware that they are entrapped inside the disc each time it is replayed. They try to escape the stadium, but they cannot. And then after they fail, they start resorting to human sacrifice in hopes of pleasing the god that imprisoned them. But at the start of every replay, they all come back to life with perfect memory of who did what to whom in the previous iteration. So here's some lighter ones. Number 66 is a ball of red yarn that defends itself by broadcasting Beethoven's Second Symphony at deafening volume if someone comes up to it. Number 2006 is a shape-shifting entity that turns into whatever it thinks is scary to human beings, and the foundation has figured out how to stop it by showing very bad horror movies from the 1950s to it. Number 4338 is a volcano god on a Pacific island that historically demanded human sacrifices from local villagers, but one of the foundation researchers accidentally dropped a chocolate bar into the lava, so now the volcano eats junk food. And number 4444 is a triangular extraterrestrial mind control probe that has been lodged in the skull of Al Gore since 1998. So here are just some photographs. This is what the foundation website looks like. Just the front page. This is the Russian branch of the SCP Foundation. It is actually, if I'm not mistaken, the second largest branch. They put a lot of effort into this. Here are all the languages: Russian, Korean, Chinese, French, Polish, Spanish, Thai, Japanese, German, Italian, Ukrainian, Portuguese, Czech. Here's from various artwork about the SCP Foundation. This is what an artist imagines the community or the one of their research facilities to look like. Here's a screenshot from one of the video games. Ditto for this. This is also a screenshot from one of the video games. So, okay, Russia and SCP, fund SCP. So the SCP Foundation is very popular in Russia. Enthusiasts have created, as I said, a comparable Russian language website. In 2017, the fact that SCP was very popular in Russia was drawn to the attention of a businessman who attempted to fraudulently trademark the entire thing, because it is all open source, with the Eurasian Customs Union in order to profit from these materials. And the SCP community in Russia actually raised $150,000 to hire a lawyer and file a case with the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service, which did, in fact, revoke the trademark in last year. So there's even some money to be made if you have an entrepreneurial point of view. So what are some Russian-themed SCPs? Well, a lot of the SCPs deal with, as I said, Russia, Soviet Union, Cold War, KGB, FSB. A lot of them, which is the topic of our conference, deal with decaying communist-era infrastructure and the like. Some topics, this is not exhaustive, include Chernobyl, the Soviet nuclear system, an old Soviet radio tower, an enormous machine in northern Siberia, and a sunken Soviet submarine on the ocean floor. And all of these things are like mysteries about those objects. Many SCPs, interestingly, focus on the Cold War and attempts by the KGB and the CIA to weaponize supernatural objects for an advantage during the Cold War. So for the remainder of this talk, I'll just give you a case study of one, which I think is very rich and very interesting and very relevant to our conference. So it'll be about a dystopian post-Soviet cityscape with many symbolic interpretations. It's SCP-1499, and it is a Soviet GP5 gas mask, which, if I'm not mistaken, was used commonly during the Afghanistan war, that teleports the wearer to a flat, barren dimension interspersed with tall black towers. If the mask is removed, the wearer returns to the place he or she started from. The 1499 dimension is populated and patrolled by frightening creatures, quote, tall nude humanoids with dark skin that have a thick coat of an unknown viscous substance. They also have a large amounts of eyes and mouths covering their bodies. They will attack the mask wearer if the person is seen, but nonetheless, the Foundation still seeks to understand this anomaly and conducts some tests on it. They sent an agent into the 1499 dimension to do an examination. The agent realizes that the entities are all gravitating toward an extremely large black building. Upon entering the building, the agent sees that there is some kind of ritual being performed. One of the entities has cut open its own torso and huge worms are emerging from inside. The agent becomes very agitated and he states to his superiors over the radio that he must stop what is happening at any price. He draws his gun and he attacks the entities, and then he runs toward the one that has cut itself open and reaches for the worms. He then removes the gas mask from his head and is teleported back to the Foundation Research Center, where he is holding a human heart in his hands. And there's a subsequent news report provided. This is fictional, of course. On Sunday, June 3rd, a man dressed in a suit and wearing a gas mask attacked the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, Russia, during morning services. The man reportedly shot 10 people, including a chanter and a priest. 6 churchgoers were killed, and 3 others, including the chanter, are in critical condition. The suspect charged to the front of the cathedral and allegedly produced a knife and removed the priest's heart. The suspect then appeared to vanish entirely before multiple witnesses. Moscow police have been unable to find any trace of the attacker. So as you can see, there is clearly a connection between what happened in that other dimension and what happened in this fictional Moscow. So here are just some pictures, and then there's a short video I'll show you. This is what the gas mask looks like, GP5 mask. This is what the dimension looks like. It has been rendered by several different artists and in many video games. This is another view of this dimension. This is what it looks like through the mask. So when you're in it, you're wearing a gas mask, so it's much more blurry. This is the entities walking toward the viewer. Here's one of the entities on the ground raising its head to the heavens. Now, hopefully this will work. I'm going to show you a very quick video of the SCP Foundation, this particular SCP. Okay, so as you can see, a very creative and interesting, hellish dystopian hellscape. So, final part of this talk, I'll just give you an analysis of my personal analysis of this SCP and some of its implications. Now, first of all, I should just say that whoever wrote this SCP, it was written anonymously, seems to have a negative impression of the post-Soviet landscape and of Russia in general. So listeners should just be aware that there may be a polemical dimension to this, some polemical criticism of Russian society. Now, as I said, as we read about SCP-1499 and watch these visualizations of it in games, it becomes clear that dimension is meant to represent the underworld or noumenon, Kantian noumenon of Russia. Actions that are taken in the dimension manifest in real locations. In Moscow, the humanoid entities correspond to actual people. It is, and this is crucial, it is left deliberately unclear whether the mask allows the wearer to see the true nature of the Russian world, or if it is a corrupted lens that re-Sovietizes the country, reflecting the object's presence during traumatic events of the Soviet past. In other words, does it show us how the world really looks? Or does it carry a traumatic memory of the Soviet Union that it imprints onto our world? This is a question I have thought about quite a bit. So first theme I would highlight here is surveillance. Now, as you may have noticed, there are hundreds of eyes on the bodies of these entities, and this may represent the transformation of Soviet citizens into tool of the NKVD or KGB surveillance state. When the creatures approach one another, this is not seen in what we watched, but they either do not give a sign of acknowledgement and pass each other, or sometimes they violently assault one another, coating the nearby ground and observing entities with unknown fluid and thick viscera. They also sometimes stop to look at other entities from a distance. These scenes could represent the degrading effect of mass surveillance and informant culture on social cohesion. The creatures seem to have become empty vessels without meaningful relationships. Periodically, they escalate into nihilistic violence. Also hinted at, I think, is the pointlessness of surveillance overall and repression overall. The creatures do not seem to do anything productive. This suggests that the higher purpose of the many eyes in their bodies has long been lost or forgotten. Why are they watching each other? What is the reason? So there's an underworld cityscape, as you've seen. All of these entities look identical, and all of these structures that you see in the dimension are featureless and black, and they extend infinitely off into the distance. This is probably a commentary on the degrading effects of communist cityscapes on life, personality, and the soul. The shapes, actually, of the structures do somewhat differ. There's a mixture of cubes, rectangles, tubes, etc. These could be after images of different kinds of Soviet buildings, e.g. Khrushchevki, government ministries, military installations, missile silos. But since they are all blackened and monumental, they have no windows, doors, they have no distinguishing characteristics, which hints that whatever original purpose they had has been long forgotten. They are now features of an endless dystopia. Also hinted at is environmental degradation. So as you see, the entities are physically deformed, and this may reflect in Soviet environmental policies and conditions. The ground is totally flat. It has no elevated areas. The only way to see the landscape from a height is to climb one of the black structures. This could point to the effects of environmental destruction caused by Soviet development, which leaves, after everything is over, simply crumbling buildings in a barren landscape populated by shell husks of human beings. Now, the fact that a gas mask is required to navigate this world is also evidence of this interpretation. As you might have noticed, there's a low, hazy mist clinging close to the ground everywhere, suggesting that the gas mask is required. The air has become polluted. Also, the war in Afghanistan seems to have an echo here. This may be interpreted as a projection of war trauma. You may notice that the entities don't walk upright. They have a distinctive limping gait reminiscent of an injured leg or torso. This evokes the plight of wounded Afghans who returned from the war maimed and scarred. And here also the gas mask is important because these veterans filter what they see of their homeland and the country they come home to through this mask. And so if we follow this line of reasoning, the dimension seems to symbolize the disillusionment of Russian soldiers and their families. And finally, I just want to mention there's the question of the Orthodox Church, which, as we all know, suffered much persecution in the Soviet era. And the author of this SCP seems to be invoking this history, although the implications are open interpretation. I'm not exactly sure. It's all debatable. Certainly, from what is described in the document, they seem to be worshiping a false god. But is it the Orthodox Church deformed beyond recognition by repression? Or are they worshiping the Soviet state itself? That's a good question. And what does the monster they are summoning represent? Is this some kind of demonic ritual as assumed by the Foundation agent? Or is it some kind of exorcism that is trying to excise trauma from the Russian past. So anyway, just to conclude, I think the SCP Foundation offers a very fascinating and virtually completely understudied insight into how post-Soviet imagination evolved on the internet in the last 10 to 15 years. And my goal here has been to introduce listeners to the SCP universe and to its scholarly potential, and to demonstrate how the Foundation can repurpose Soviet imagery to create this very distorted portrait of the Russian world. As I mentioned, SCP-1499 is an ambiguous thesis on Russian history. It has rich symbolism, provides much food for thought. It evokes many of the USSR's central traumas, including Afghanistan, pollution, the persecution of Christians, surveillance, ideological material conformity, etc. So just in conclusion, I encourage listeners to take a look at the SCP Foundation page in Russian or in English, whichever you prefer, or in German or any of the other languages. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the other presentation.
Thank you very much, Philip. Thank you very much. I am sure that we met now future recycled, but now we continue. And the next paper will be presented by Maya Nadkarni, Associate Professor of Anthropology at Swarthmore College, Nostalgia and Hungry Remains of Socialism. Please, Maya.
Thank you. And so you can all see my screen, I hope. So I want to thank the organizers for putting together such an excellent 3 days of conversation. And I really apologize that because I'm in the US, I've had to miss the morning sessions, and I'm looking forward to checking them out on YouTube. So I know everyone's really tired, and I appreciate your patience in listening to one last paper, and I'll get started. So in the early summer of 2002, I met a group of friends at an open air bar in a leafy neighborhood in Buda. As we sat chatting, my friend Robert, then in his early 50s, suddenly stood up and walked over to a nearby table where two teenage girls were loudly complaining as they struggled to open bottles of the soda Bombi. Let's get this there. A citrus-flavored soda produced in the 1960s as a Hungarian socialist alternative to banned Western brands, Bombi had recently been re-released in the soda's distinctive original swing top bottle. Its return was part of a growing nostalgic industry in Hungary that sought to capitalize upon Hungarians' fond memories of the material and popular culture of the socialist past. As I watched, the teenagers laughed as Robert quickly showed them how to flip up the wire cage that surrounded the bottle cap. He then came back to our table and shrugged. Well, why would they know how to open it, he said. They didn't grow up with it. From previous conversations, I knew that Robert had been briefly imprisoned on a false charge in the early 1970s, and that he was very bitter about his early years growing up under state socialism. But now he merely grinned at the sudden experience of expertise based upon his own childhood as a socialist consumer. I never thought there would be anything useful about what I learned under communism, he joked. Bombi was not the only socialist era icon to make a comeback more than a decade after the end of state socialism. Beginning in the mid-1990s, socialist nostalgia appeared in Hungary, as it did elsewhere, representing not only a popular marketing trend, but a broad set of cultural practices that inspired films, books, museum exhibitions, nightclubs, coffee houses, and the revival of socialist brands and products. As Robert's experience suggests, nostalgia's success may have derived from the ambiguity of its references and ideological content, and thus its ability to mobilize different consumers with different relationships to the socialist past. For the teenagers who couldn't open the bottles of Bombi they had ordered, the appeal of nostalgic marketing lay in its exoticism, objects that represented a temporal remoteness as glamorous as the bars that were popular then that were named after Alcatraz and Wall Street. For members of the older generation, particularly those dispossessed by the social and economic uncertainties of post-socialism, nostalgia offered an idiom through which to voice longing for the safer and more secure material circumstances of late state socialism. And for yet others, like Robert, who denied any desire to return to the past and who told me that he hated the flavor of Bombi, nostalgic marketing prompted the amused recognition of a set of skills and experiences, however unwillingly acquired, that was suddenly gaining ironic new value by their post-socialist commodification. Now, obviously, nostalgia's ability to accommodate multiple audiences and relationships to the past is not unique to Hungary. Indeed, as the anthropologist Kathy Stewart has argued, nostalgia is a cultural practice. It is not a specific content. So despite the apparent similarity of nostalgic forms and activities across the former Soviet Union and its satellites, what drives nostalgia can range from longing for material entitlements to pride in local production, and from explicitly political aspirations to the decontextualization of nostalgia as pure style. But what has made nostalgia so useful as a category of practice has also challenged attempts to deploy it as a tool of analysis. And indeed, nostalgia has inspired a wide range of responses, both locally and also in international scholarship. Whether they stigmatize nostalgia as anti-democratic and the sign of failed transition, or they hail it as a means for imagining alternatives to neoliberalism. Okay. So I have just a few blank slides as well, because not every point I want to make is supported by images. So that's not a glitch. So most scholars agree that at the heart of nostalgic practices is an understanding of time as linear and irreversible. That is, and I apologize because I'm the last paper, so I feel like much of what I'm saying is very repetitive of points that other people made, but I'll continue on. Nostalgia may seem to have antique origins, but in fact, it is the product of a modern temporality that views individuals and societies as caught up in a destructive flow of time, irreversibly torn from their origins. The longing that characterizes nostalgia is thus premised upon the impossibility of return. But if nostalgia is defined by its inability to return to the past, the relationship of various nostalgic manifestations to the future is more ambiguous. Indeed, as I think some of the other papers have also discussed, nostalgia often emerges in the wake of the failure of the past's promised future to materialize. And in the Hungarian context, specifically in the first decade and a half of state socialism, when these trends of nostalgia were at their peak, what would make socialist nostalgia so compelling was the way it enabled multiple audiences to sustain and to reimagine the bright futures that they had longed for during the socialist era. In other words, it was not the failure of the past's future, but rather various attempts to insist that the past's dreams of the future were still alive and could be kept alive that would fuel this trend of nostalgia in Hungary. And I shall argue it would only be with the perceived loss of that future in the wake of Hungary's financial crises and ongoing political challenges that socialist nostalgia would lose its allure. And I should be clear here that when I talk about the dream of the future, I'm not talking about the communist utopia promised by the regime, but rather the fantasy of what the end of the regime would entail, both in terms of political freedoms and also of a living standard and material entitlements equivalent to that in Western Europe. So I want to provide a brief overview of what distinguished these nostalgic practices in Hungary before then going on to examine what the current absence of such practices in Hungary helps us to understand about historical and temporal imaginings more recently. So I'd like to begin by noting that the marketing of Hungary's socialist kitsch began even before its first democratic elections took place in 1990. As city officials in Budapest and the countryside began to remove communist-era monuments and street names, Hungarians celebrated the end of the regime by reviving it with ironic parties or marketing the remainders of official state culture as kitsch to themselves or to foreign tourists. Such practices didn't seek to return to the socialist era. Instead, they celebrated the commodification and consumption of socialist remains as proof of both the country's distance from the recent past and the triumph of their long anticipated transition to capitalism. So for example, in 1990, a communist-themed pizza opened up under the name of Marxism, which was a play both on the French restaurant Maxime and of course Marxism. And with a red star and an interior decorated with posters of Lenin and other state socialist kitsch, the restaurant was advertised with the slogan, "The outside may be communist, but we are capitalist to the very marrow of our bones." But more was at stake in such marketing of the recent past than simply ironic laughter and capitalist triumphalism. Rather, these efforts were embedded within a broader context of memory practices that found paradoxical new value not only in busts of Lenin, but also the material detritus of everyday life in the past era. This logic was epitomized in the popular 2002 book, Rainbow Department Store, an idiosyncratic collection of the poet Zoltán Bosch's personal memories inspired by socialist era brands, foods, toys, cigarettes, etc. The nostalgia of Rainbow Department Store neither mocked the past system nor mourned it as a political entity. Instead, the author took pleasure in recalling the fantasies of the past era, as well as what was now understood to be its childlike innocence, shielded under the hand of state paternalism. Such everyday objects and the vanishing socialities, practices, and forms of knowledge they represented now appeared more authentic and more soulful than the world of Western goods that had long been the object of Hungarian citizens' fantasies under state socialism. And while I don't have time to go into this in more detail in my published work on this topic, I've argued that such nostalgia didn't come out of nowhere. Rather, it represented an ironic reversal of the longings for Western consumer goods and standards of living that had structured socialist era subjectivities, right? So this was the desire for Western genes and not Eastern Bloc imitations. But after the economic challenges of the first decade of post-socialism, an era in Hungary that was known as one of wild capitalism, and which disenchanted Hungary's dreams of not only consumer plenitude, but of kind of quickly catching up on all measures to the standards set by Western Europe. Nostalgia emerged to recapture the structure of fantasy under the previous regime by projecting it onto a new target. So now it was socialist styles of objects that were assigned the same emotional value that had been once invested in foreign goods. In other words, products that were formerly stigmatized as cheap imitations of the West now appeared increasingly desirable compared to now disenchanted Western brands and products. This wave of socialist nostalgia was most popular in Hungary among what I call the transitional generation. And so this is distinct from the last Soviet generation that many of us have been talking about. The transitional generation was born between the mid-60s and mid-1970s, just a little bit younger. And they were the ones who came of age, who came into adulthood just as communism was ending. And thus kind of the personal journey of entering adulthood was paralleled by the countrywide task of remaking the nation itself as a new post-socialist subject and throwing off the shackles of state paternalism. And so this is a poster from a film that was made in 2000 that chronicles the experience of that generation, one in which political considerations took a back seat to the adolescent pleasures of parties, girls, and cars. And in some ways, it's similar to the Black and White World TV show that Tony discussed yesterday. But here, I think the political context was even more de-emphasized. Nostalgia enabled this transitional generation to recuperate the shared experience of growing up under state socialism at a moment when such a sense of community was rapidly stratifying, excuse me, along social and economic lines, as well as the polarization of party politics. By disavowing any political import to the cozy sensations evoked by nostalgia, these nostalgic consumers were able to avoid bringing such memories into dialogue with more explicitly politicized experiences of oppression under the previous regime. Instead, nostalgia enabled them to retain the value of past experiences while refusing to pass definitive judgment upon their broader and historical context. It provided one of the few safe discourses available for talking about the past, a way to not talk about the past while talking about it. Moreover, by arguing for the value of remembering the shared experience of growing up under state socialism, nostalgia offered an ironic form of shared cultural heritage that challenged Western regimes of cultural value that often otherwise positioned Hungarians as inferior. As one of my interlocutors explained, we know how to be Western, but we also have additional knowledge that Westerners lack. For example, a 2001 television advertisement for the popular Hungarian beer Dreher presented a dazzling selection of teenage slang images and icons from the socialist 1980s with the slogan, "We speak one language." This assertion of solidarity ended with a group of successful yuppie 30-somethings enjoying their Dreher beers at a fashionable bar. Here, socialist nostalgia did not mourn the past. Rather, it celebrated the status quo. It suggested that one could have it all, that one can redeem the past as a source of cultural value, while at the same time produce oneself as Western by consuming and achieving at Western levels. The cosmopolitan fantasy embedded in such advertisements appealed most directly to those members of the transitional generation who belonged to the urban middle class, but also served as a source of aspiration for those who had not yet enjoyed the fruits of transition. And it also legitimized more restorative nostalgias by an older generation dispossessed of socialist era security and entitlements. So again, another blank slide. To sum up, the emotions conjured up by nostalgia, not only mourning, but amusement, affection, and pride, helped to make visible several interconnected fantasies about the relationship between past, present, and future in post-socialist Hungary. Nostalgia gave voice to the desire that Hungarians could both break from an unwanted past by entering its longed-for future and recuperate that past as the source of present-day value. And this fantasy by which one enters the future by redeeming an unpalatable past, a dream, in other words, where everything changes and nothing is lost, enabled a fantasy of not being left behind oneself. That is the hope that dealing with the legacies and remains of the communist era would not slow down Hungary's reinvention as a prosperous democratic subject. The apparent desire of nostalgia to return to or recapture the past thus in fact functioned to distance it and to legitimize the experience of transition itself. But the productivity of these fantasies would only be possible as long as the present appeared to have in some way triumphed over the past. And so I now want to just talk briefly in my remaining time about how the experiences of crisis and disappointment that followed in the years afterwards, they did not fuel nostalgic longing, but they rather overturned the conditions of its possibility. So let me just return to the example of Maxim, opened in the early 1990s as part of a wave of triumphalist marketing of Soviet kitsch. Nearly 20 years later, in 2010, a different mood prevailed as I sat there with one of my long-term interlocutors, Jenő. Like many members of the transitional generation, Jenő had come to regard his initial expectations of transition as painfully optimistic and naive. Now, such disappointment may be endemic to the region, but thanks to the global economic crisis in 2008 that hit Hungary with disproportionate force, the disenchantment in Hungary at that time was particularly acute. Indeed, the lack of interest in celebrating the 20th anniversary of 1989 in 2009 had suggested that transition no longer represented a chronological break, but rather a failed point of origin, a lost opportunity for transformation. But this disillusionment did not fuel a nostalgic desire to return to the communist past. To the contrary, it reflected a frustrated orientation toward the future, the disappointment that the bright future promised by transition still had not been realized. This logic that mourned not what I once had, but what I should already have now, became clear to me as Jenő paused to look around at Maxim's empty tables and faded, dusty furnishings with an ironic smile. Even this place is over its prime, he said. Making fun of this stuff feels odd now because no one says things like that anymore. Maxim no longer inspired laughter at the former era. Instead, Jenő told me, it made him feel wistful for the optimism of the early years of transition, when it seemed as if one could indeed remember the past only to laugh at it. It's not a place to ironically remember the communist past anymore, Jenő concluded. It's become a memory to itself, to how it used to be 15 years ago. Once a triumphant display of mastery over the remains of the communist era, Maxim itself was now a relic of some of the failed hopes of transition. But just because the memory work of sites like Maxim is no longer effective does not mean that everyday life in Hungary today is now free of objects and iconography of the communist past. To the contrary, bars, stores, and products that are drawn from or reference Hungary's decades of state socialism are more popular than ever. The key difference, however, is that neither consumers nor local commentators interpret these practices as nostalgic. That is, the forms may be similar, but the affective and commemorative content is decidedly different. As my colleague Kriszti Fehérváry has observed, these practices represent a new form of retro that does not seek to redeem the socialist past, but rather re-narrates its objects as embedded in an alternative national history that was never cut off by an iron curtain from the regimes of value in the modern world. That is, the revival of Hungarian brands such as Tisza sneakers makes visible an argument for coeval modernity. in which Hungary never needed to catch up with the West in the first place because its own consumer culture evolved alongside that of capitalist countries. Such retro thus enables a pride in national achievement that does not need to disavow its relationship to the political regime that produced these products, because the historical context of state socialism is now viewed as irrelevant. The narrative of retro is thus not premised upon the notion of temporal break that characterizes nostalgia. Rather, it posits a seamless line of continuity that extends from the past into the present day. But, and I just want to say this in conclusion, in addition to Jenő's lament of a lost future and what Fehérváry calls the material nationalism of retro, there are other discourses which insist that the socialist past is still with us, specifically vis-a-vis the right-wing party Fidesz that was elected to power in 2010 with a promise that it would finally achieve the work of transition. Now, I don't have time to go into their politics or policies, but many critics have argued that Fidesz has revived the communist past under the guise of eliminating it in terms of their governance, centralization, etc. And over the past decade, I've heard repeated comparisons between the communist and Fidesz regimes. And what's most crucial about these complaints, I would argue, these claims that we've returned to communism or we've returned to capitalism is not that they are only critiquing Fidesz, right? But they're also it's a form of self-critique, right? In which people are trying to express their own sense that they are unable to affect political change and the feelings of disillusionment and apathy that result. So many of my interlocutors have told me that they feel so politically impotent that they've retreated into their domestic and private concerns, just as they did, or their parents did, as subjects of state socialism a generation ago. So I want to end by noting that, of course, there are as many differences as similarities between Fidesz's illiberal democracy and Kadar's refrigerator socialism. But I nonetheless want to take this complaint that we've returned to communism seriously as a form of historical argumentation in which neither a fantasized future nor a cozy but ambivalent past is providing useful points of navigation. Instead, this perception of a doubled temporal loss, of a past that refuses to stay past, and a future that fails to be realized, has disabled nostalgia of its redemptive possibility. Just to sum up, in the early years of post-socialism, nostalgia offered a fantasy of national and personal transformation, in which everything changes but nothing is lost. But with the inability to feel distant and superior to one's previous selves, the triumphalism of these earlier practices has vanished. Rather than fuel nostalgic longing, political frustration has overturned the very conditions for nostalgia's possibility. So while other forms of cultural recycling of the socialist past may continue, they no longer possess the sense of temporal irreversibility that characterizes nostalgia. And thus they don't do the same kinds of cultural and political work that nostalgia was able to accomplish in the past. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maya. Your role was actually difficult to be the last speaker, but now we have time for discussion and question to all four speakers. Please, your questions. I see that Katriona would like to ask something. Please, Katriona.
Thank you very much. It was a fascinating session. I actually have got questions which I think are, if not to the entire run of speakers, but at least could be discussed by them. And I've been thinking hard as the discussion went on. Unfortunately, I've missed quite a lot of the conference. You may have had discussions about this going through, in which case, forgive me, but about the whole relationship between terms and nostalgia, of course. I mean, does nostalgia really mean anything apart from the perspective that the observer is taking on something? It seems to me a thoroughly evaluative term, which is actually not analytically useful in some ways. I mean, I'm trying to be provocative here. And the thing about recycling is it seems to me advantageous precisely in that it doesn't posit that sort of evaluative attitude towards the way that people are using things, and therefore might be seen as more anthropological actually, and relates to the sort of work that's been going on about rubbish, for example. So Michael Thompson's work, which goes back after all, quite a long way. So that was the first thing. I mean, we have obviously the overall category of memory politics, and then which terms within that overall category of memory politics, and I suppose that I'm used to dealing with this historically more, might be sort of more useful than others. And that might be something that all the speakers want to come back on. My second point is actually about what one might call sort of user participation. And we've had a lot about content, but much less about the response to that from the floor. And actually the internet particularly gives us a fantastic sort of overview of that process happening, much more obviously than, say restaurants back then, or indeed films. And I mean, one of the things that I've noticed, as a Facebook user, is that there's a very active group, anti-nostalgia group, which is called Nie nравится СССР. So what I hate about the Soviet Union is probably the most adequate translation. It's much more active actually than the nostalgia groups. The other thing is that its participants, insofar as one can tell, are often Ukrainian and from the Baltic states, and then sometimes unpleasant wrangles break out when people use a language that isn't Russian. So then that becomes, in Russia, as the lingua franca for those people. So it's also interesting from that point of view. But they have a term which is very widely used, which is a sovka drocha. So somebody, excuse any Russian speakers, because it's quite it's not obscene, but it's a sort of fairly unprintable term. So like Soviet wankers, who are people who kind of, participate in these affirmative sites. Of course, affirmation isn't just about the former socialist world. It's also a kind of cultural trope in Western media now. And I mean, we all know that essentially people get very offended if you say something critical about their post. I mean, it's not for that. I mean, posts are for people to be admired and get several million likes. And I mean, to oversimplify, I mean, in Russia, it works a bit differently like that because people want interaction and it can sometimes be negative and they like that as well. But I mean, there can be different attitudes. But the fact remains that, I mean, I think we do have to look at that. I mean, in other words, who's watching these films? Who's reading these posts? Who's having these arguments? And we have a fantastic resource out there. And I mean, obviously things like moderation. So how interventionist the moderator is very important. I mean, in the Nie nравится СССР, if you ever dare to post something which is even vaguely approving about something in the form of Soviet Union, not only will you be called a sovka drocha by every participant, but the moderator will step in and say that she's going to remove your post because that's not what the site is for. So there's obviously a kind of sort of participatory side of it there. So those were just sort of two things that occurred. I mean, people may not want to answer them straight away. There'll be other questions, but I mean, there's a sort of way of trying to formulate a response to the session as a whole and get everybody involved in the discussion. And I was deliberately intending to be provocative, but not to offend anyone in particular. So please don't take offense. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catriona. I'm sure that you had to participate in our conference as a speaker also. I don't know how I missed this opportunity to invite you. I don't know how this happened.
Honest, I just said
Sorry
no,
for this.
It's been the fourth talk in 1 week. So
yeah.
Please don't worry. I mean, it's not.
Okay, Thomas, please, your question. Thomas, please, your question. Or
Yes, I'm here. Thank you very much. I got a question for Philip. Sort of
we cannot hear you. Please
Sorry?
closer to the microphone.
Yeah, really? Better now?
Better.
Okay, I have no problem with it all weekend. Question or sort of half remark for Philip. Thank you very much for introducing this topic because this is really fascinating. I'm doing research on post-Soviet imaginations of the Russian periphery, and I've been sort of looking for more online phenomena to include. So I'm definitely going to make sure to have a look at the periphery themed SCPs you mentioned there about constructions in Siberia and everything grand. About those sort of Cold War themed SCPs that you mentioned, my question: do you see a general proximity between these SCPs and cultures of conspiratorial thinking that arise in thinking about the late Soviet Union and the lost last heydays of the Cold War and so on. That's one question. And my other one, very specifically to this SCP you introduced, I found your argument, your interpretation very convincing. But I've also, like from the beginning, when it came to this newspaper report, then about the shooting in Christus Basitilia, I thought this also reminds me a lot of a Cold Mirror, Black Mirror episode. There you go. A lot of this Black Mirror episode where you follow a group of soldiers in some sort of rural area, not specified where, I think, and they take on these creatures that mutated, or humans that mutated in the consequence of some sort of virus, and they think they have to wipe them out to secure the safety of the population that is not infected. And then sort of over the episode, it turns out one person finds out that this is actually not at all true, and that they're injected with some sort of device or something. I don't remember quite how it worked technologically. Okay, apparently they're injected with some sort of device to see these people only like that, in order to lower their threshold of violence, and actually they're conducting a genocide. They're conducting an ethnical purge there. So I was wondering if you know sort of if this SCP was published after this Black Mirror episode, or if there might be some sort of possible interpretation like that as well, making American soldiers maybe more prone to shooting at Russians there.
Philip?
Okay, so I'll just answer that. Thank you very much, Thomas, for these questions, and also great to hear of your interest in SCP. I have indeed watched the Black Mirror episode you're talking about. It's a digital device. It's a way that they distort the appearance of the person through a digital implant. Yeah. So I actually don't know if probably around the same time. I'm going to guess that episode came out like 2013, 14, and I'm going to guess that 1499 was written maybe around 2013, because it's roughly chronological. So the number corresponds to the chronology. So earlier on in this series. But yes, I think this is actually the central question about the SCP, which is, what is the mask really doing? Is it revealing reality as it is, or is it distorting, right? And if it is distorting, is that because it has absorbed some kind of traumatic thing from its time as a gas mask in the Afghan war, right? And so that actually is, you could endlessly go back and forth. There's a lot of like Kantian, noumenon, phenomenon, reality discussions about this particular SCP. So anyway, yes, just a lot of food for thought there. Regarding conspiratorial thinking in the late Cold War, there is indeed an SCP called SCP 1984. Nice. And it's about the Soviet dead hand second strike nuclear system. And the idea is that they have mummified a Soviet officer to have his dead body will launch the nukes if everything else fails. And so that, I think, there is a sense of desperation, causing nihilistic destruction that does emerge from this SCP. And in general, a lot of the SCPs do have this shared theme of violence for unknown reasons, deforming and destroying things for reasons that are beyond our comprehension. Yes, so, and regarding a question about conspiratorial thinking, I think certainly that might be a reason why it's so attractive to a lot of, on internet, people in Russia on the internet. Some certain conspiratorial cultures probably go quite well with the SCP universe. The whole idea is that it's a secretive organization that does things behind the backs of society, even behind the backs of governments. Right, so the whole thing is by its nature a conspiracy to hide this from the public. So yes, I think definitely much research to be done connecting those two phenomena.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll write you an email about that once I've looked into a few of those and had a few sleepless nights over them probably.
Would be happy to read and reply.
Grand. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Alexei, please, your question.
Yes, thank you very much for these fascinating presentations. I have a question to Philip as well. I didn't quite get how the Afghan war comes to the this video game essentially. GP as a гражданский противогаз номер 5 is the civilian gas mask, which was distributed, you know, even in schools and in some regions in Soviet Union. That was at first. That's why it has this very short nozzle. So I don't get the connection to the Afghanistan, and then from this short clip, I also didn't get the connection to Afghanistan. Did they mention it? Do they mention any other words? I mean, Chechnya is much closer to collective memory. So yeah, these kind of questions.
So I do not know whether Afghanistan, I don't think Afghanistan is explicitly mentioned. I mean, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head of the possible interpretations of this. It's very possible, if it is indeed a civilian gas mask, then perhaps the Afghanistan interpretation is not as valid. But it might very well strengthen the environmental degradation interpretation, where it's civilians who experience the Soviet environment. And require a gas mask.
Okay, then I was thinking that maybe we should, since it is a video game, there are oodles of similar video games which exploit this post-apocalyptic environment. If we're talking about the Soviet past, Stalker is the most important one in this, because it is connected to Chernobyl and this catastrophe and so on. So that there you can have some you know, very strong exploitation of the Soviet past. In this video, it was sort of very far-fetched. I thought that was some kind of post-apocalyptic ground. So probably it should be connected to that genre more than, especially the Afghan war. I mean, you didn't use any kind of gas mask in Afghanistan because, you know, why would you? So I was thinking about this cultural reference rather than the real events from the Soviet or Russian past.
Yes, I thank you very much for this emendation, and I think perhaps this could be a better framing for this particular SCP. I also would add Metro 2033 for those who know. There's also this post-apocalyptic theme. Actually, gas masks are featured very prominently in that game, and so that is also something, a potential for future research and for future writing as well, connecting this genre. And I'm sure, incidentally, there's a lot of overlap between SCP players and Metro players.
Dear colleagues, we have some more questions. Sorry, please ask your questions and answer more briefly. Arkadiusz, please, your question.
So I will try. I've got some question to Ola. I want to ask about this post-peasant idea, because you put this idea, this term in your title of your presentation, but maybe it's hot and I'm tired, but and I missed something, but I realized that I don't know why you use this post-peasant idea and what does it mean for you?
Should I answer right away, Valerie?
Yes, of course, please.
Okay. So I recognize that post-peasant isn't the nicest way describe it. I just took it from, yeah, I know. I just took it from an article from a Slovakian academic who was describing the relationship that the Slovak society had with the past and with memory about communism in their context. And I found it quite appropriate to speak about Polish nostalgia, because it's not, as I was talking about social nostalgia, where you don't remember really the political reality. It's this kind of disconnection from the political reality and what you remember as a person. But on top of that, you have this different relationship with your fellow citizens. So it's about missing the spontaneous reactions from people, missing this romanticized maybe image of society, how it should work, you know, how people are just working together to cheat on the regime, to cheat on people in power just to get by with their life. They have different relationship with people working for the state. So it's not about being you know, the clear cut between me and them isn't that pronounced as in German Nostalgie, where you have really difference between Western Germans and Eastern German in a Polish society. I thought it was a different kind of relationship between us and them. There is no such thing as us and them. We are all in this mess and we are trying to get by. And so a post-peasant for this Slovakian academic, Buzelka, I can send you the article. It's quite fascinating. It's about this togetherness and this community of people who are working together to get by with their daily life. Basically, that's what post-peasant mean, and attachment to the land. So this is why I use this term to differentiate between German nostalgia, which is different kind of social nostalgia as well, but it's different for me.
You think that it's the difference between Polish, Slovakian, or Hungarian post-peasant and Polish
Definitely.
one? Because
yeah. The problem is, I'm sorry, Valerie, I will just tell you, the resources that I get from Canada are quite different than if I was in Poland. I don't have resources. You know, I can read in Polish or in German, but there are not so many resources. And Buzelka was the only one which was translated in English that I could access from my university. But if you have more articles, I can read more.
Mm-hmm. Because this peasant is, I think, more complicated in Polish case.
Definitely much more complicated. We can talk further.
Also because of new discourse in the press and so on. The problem of how Polish people come from this peasant and so on. It's not the nobles, but peasant and so on. It's the whole discussion in Poland right now.
It's much more complicated from a Polish perspective. I know, that's why I said in the conclusions that to categorize Polish nostalgia for me is much more difficult than categorize German nostalgia. Okay. It's different.
Thank you, Ole. Anna, your question.
Okay, actually, just one more brief comment on the most popular film of this conference, referencing to what you wonderfully showed, this whole kind of continuity, between their image of Zoe in these films of late 80s and now, because in Leta there is a character played by Alexander Bashirov, who appeared also in Assa and Igla, and he complains for those young guys that they are not thankful enough for the government who gave them the education so they could plant the tree. And when I heard this and just remembered the end scene and the end song of this film, it just referred wonderfully for me how, you know, this whole soundtrack and whole intertext and which are supposed to refer for this previous image of Tsoi from the cinema of the late 80s, how it all worked together wonderfully. So yeah, that was just the comment, and thank you everyone for all those presentation. It was really, really interesting to know the whole perspective and points of view. Thank you.
Dear colleague, we have to finish our meeting, but I have some points, very important points to share with you. Sorry for borrowing your attention for a couple of minutes. First of all, I would like to say thanks. I do not have English words enough to express my expressions to all the participants of the conference. I feel I'm a kind of recycler who during these 3 days intensively borrowed your ideas with an intention to reuse it with references, of course, later. I would like to thank my colleagues from organizing committee from various universities: Arkadiusz, Piotr, Lyubov Bugaeva, Susanna Frank, Alexander Panchenko, who supported me, my idea, and helped me every time when I needed their help. I also have to thank Yulia Sikushina. Yulia, please show your face. You are here. I see you. Thank you very much. Who helped us with organizing conference during the most critical period before the conference and during the conference. From time to time, you saw her face and regularly heard her voice. She is not only a talented organizer, she is a very gifted young scholar, anthropologist. I'm very afraid that every anthropologist who I met during my career. So, Yulia, I'm afraid of you also. And Zinaida, the same. And I would like to thank another our colleague who was with us during all the conference, but invisibly behind the picture of Pushkinsky Dom. You can see it. This is a very important person, Natalia Suzenis. She is an important person because she is the chief of PR department of the Pushkinsky Dom. Without her assistant, the conference would not be possible. Natalia, can you show yourself? I did not see you. Wave me, please, if you can. Okay. Please forgive me if I forgot somebody. This is very exciting for me, and I really can forget something. And 2 words about our future. This is about a review. I think it is impossible to leave this our papers, our discussion without any trace on paper or maybe in the internet. So I have a negotiation with a journal now to publish a review of our conference in this journal. This was not we are not able to publish abstracts, but we can publish a review of our conference. So for this aim, I kindly ask you to send me a very short abstract of your papers as we heard them. Please try to think theoretically, not only empirically, but theoretically. This journal asked me to think theoretically, to put our subject in the context of theoretical discussions. And another reason why I ask you to send me your abstracts again, in addition to your proposals, is we would like to decide whether is it possible to use our paper for a collection of articles based on the topic of the conference? When we will receive your abstract, we will discuss this question and will come with a conclusion. I don't know which one. So please, if you have any questions, little questions, and if you have some words to say now, please do it, and we finish our meeting. Dear colleagues.
Okay.
Piotr, please.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Valery, do you remember our meeting together with Arek Lewicki in Chicago in 2017? It was the first time that we talked about the conference, but we did not know yet what the topic would be. And, and now, 4 years and one pandemic later, we could meet in almost St. Petersburg. So yes. I want to thank you that despite these adverse circumstances, you organized everything. Thank you and your colleague. And finally, I think the conference showed us how important is the topic for our research is, of course, but how important this topic is for our understanding of the contemporary world, our social, cultural, and political reality. So what can I say? It was a very pleasant and very useful time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piotr. Thank you very much. So, dear colleague, we are finished now. Thank you very much. Julia, please turn us off.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll do that. See you later. Oh.